Sold to the awkward man behind the microphone. Hello everyone, welcome to episode 166 of the Property Podcast. And yes, if you haven't guessed already, this week we're talking about auctions.
Strong intro, Rob. I like it. Very good. Yes, welcome to the Property Podcast. This is episode 166, where we are covering auctions, and we've got another interview from the Property Investor Show. So you don't just have to listen to us talking about auctions, you get to listen to someone who actually knows what they're talking about as well. We are joined by Rob Marchant from Clive Emson Auctioneers later in the show.
But before that, Rob, we've also been interviewed on the wonderful Meaningful Money podcast hosted by, of course, Pete Matthew. I'm sure the majority of our listeners know who he is, but if you don't, make sure you check out his podcast. What a great place to start than an interview with us, Rob.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to catch up with Pete. We were on his podcast, I think it was over 2 years ago now. It's been
3 years, Rob.
Is it 3 years?
It was.
That's unbelievable. Yeah, it was. But it was great to catch up with him. We're both fans of his podcast, where I know that we share a lot of listeners in common. I think he treats personal finance in much the same way that we attempt to treat property, as in kind of keeping it simple, straightforward, realistic and long term, rather than any kind of get rich quick kind of stuff. And the interview was really great fun because we got to kind of look at it from the perspective of somebody who's not necessarily in property all the time and explain some of the stuff that's going on in more general terms, explain what it means. It was just really good fun. Hopefully that came across in the interview, and we'll be linking to it in the show notes for this episode, which are at thepropertyhub.net/auction interview. So head over there and find the link over to Meaningful Money. Check out the interview, then make sure you subscribe to Pete's podcast if you don't already.
And Rob, also worth mentioning what we've been up to the last few weeks. We held another property summit, and that was awesome. We talk about the summits a lot, so we won't go into too much detail now, but other than to say thank you to the group that attended. Great group, great day. I love the summits because, yes, we pass on loads of our knowledge and advice, and that's what's expected. But when people talk and pass on advice to each other, we learn as well. There were some nuggets I took away from the day that I'm now investigating because I was like, oh, I did not know about that. And sometimes it's like, wow, that's a really big thing that I was unaware of. So it's great. While a lot of people think it's about Rob and I, and yes, we do put a lot of effort in, by the end of the day we're shattered. But we've said it before, the real value comes when everybody opens up in the group. And it's, it's a nice private, intimate group. There's only 16 in it. When they open up and they pass on their experiences, their advice, more is gained. So great group. Thank you to those who attended. And there is another one in June. It may be sold out, but worth checking out in case, because there was a couple of places left when we recorded this. So go and check that out if you're keen. Go to thepropertyhub.net/summit.
Yep, really, really good fun. Always inspiring to meet people who are doing really great things in their professional lives, are doing interesting things in property. Always a great day. Now it's time for our news story this week. In fact, we've got not one, but two news stories this week, which tie into each other very nicely. The first one is from the BBC. You'll find the links to both these stories in the show notes, propertyhub.net/auction interview. The story in the BBC is a bank of mum and dad lends $5 billion a year, according to a report from Legal and General. Apparently, parents are helping to finance in some way 25% of all UK property transactions this year, putting in an average of £17,500. And they say that if all the parental lending was combined, it would actually be a top 10 UK mortgage lender. So it ties into lots of things that we've talked about before, and indeed the next story that we're going to be talking about. But just seeing the scale of it is really, really interesting, and does kind of show you the kind of challenges that the market has when, in order to get a home at all, so much parental support is needed.
And it really ties into something we've talked about before, the haves and have-nots. Great if your parents can afford it, but what if they can't? Does that mean the next generation can't afford a property as well? Very interesting. Something we might talk about in the coming weeks. But linked to that, Barclays, Rob, have released what sounds on paper like a very sensible product, 100% lending to first-time buyers if backed by parents. So if you've got a guarantor, because that went well last time. 100% lending. A crazy story. But I think this is really what's going to be the driver of the second half of the property cycle, is banks trying to encourage first-time buyers into the market. And there's so many scenarios and outcomes that come because of this, which we will, of course, in time talk about. But here's the story. Barclays have introduced a 100% mortgage, the first to do so since the financial crisis, and it will give first-time buyers a chance to get on the market. The rate you'd expect to be ridiculously high is under 3%. It's 2.99% without putting a penny of your own cash in. There is some criteria. You need to be earning over 50k a year, but you can get 5.5 times earnings. 5.5 times earnings. So in the majority of the country, this opens up the market to a lot of people. Suddenly, across major northern towns and cities, if you're on a good combined income, then you could go and start buying your first time property with no deposit. Now, we were talking, and I say talking, we spent a good 20 minutes talking about this and other stories about economics before we went on to the podcast, and we got a bit carried away. But what we were saying before is that even as crazy as this product may sound, it still won't help first-time buyers in London. Because if you look at a higher average wage and say, okay, a combined income of 60,000, then it's only just over 300,000 for a property. You're still not buying anything in zone 1, 2, probably zone 3 as well. So this is not for central London. Maybe the southeast you can just about get away with it, but you're talking a small flat. But even though this product is what would be considered aggressive, it still won't help people in London, which I think highlights how far that market has gone.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, one that we will be returning to in more depth in the next couple of weeks, because there's loads and loads to say about this. We nearly didn't have time to record the actual podcast today because we were so busy chatting about it. So next time we'll just flip on the mics and make an episode out of it. But yeah, it is very interesting. What moves the market? Supply and demand, and the availability of credit. And if you're looking at the availability of credit, the fact that you can borrow 100% under 3% interest rates, yes, it's not going to be open to everyone, but still, it is very interesting. And there's a box out in this story that talks about how things were last time we had 100% mortgages, which is just really interesting because it's quite easy to forget. But apparently in 2007, a third of lenders offered mortgages of 100% or more, and some, including Northern Rock, offered 125% mortgages, and you wonder why it went bust. Just a reminder of the different times that we lived in. Are those times going to come again? The property cycle would suggest that they will, and maybe with this deal it's starting. But really, really interesting stuff. As I said, both news stories are going to be in the show notes at thepropertyhub.net/auction interview.
So let's get to that auction interview. We were lucky enough to grab some time with Rob Marchant from Clive Emson Auctioneers. He popped by, said hello, and we put the microphone on and asked him a few questions. Now, Rob's got plenty of experience in auctions, so this is a really, really good interview. So maybe get your pad pen out because there's some interesting things here. But we started off the interview by saying TV's got a lot to do with the popularity of auctions and auction houses for buying property. It all looks very attractive and sexy, but is it for everyone? Should all properties consider it, or is it a niche market?
No, not a niche market at all. I think the great advantage for the auction industry generally over the last 15, 20 years has been programs like Homes Under the Hammer, which have really demystified the process. Certainly when I was first involved in auctions 25 years ago, there was something of a sort of cloak and dagger, smoky back room of a pub image about it. Programs like that, and I think the industry itself generally has worked very hard to try and present a much better image to the public, meaning that, certainly all investor buyers could and should be thinking about auction. I'd go further than that and say that the general public could and should, and indeed in many cases do think about auction as a means of buying and selling property. It's not suitable for every type of property. It's not suitable for every type of buyer or seller, but increasingly 10% year on year on year, more and more transactions are going through by auction. And why wouldn't they? There's no chains, there's no messing about for 3-6 months while people decide that really they don't want to buy it or sell it after all and drop out and leave you high and dry. So I'd see no reason why it shouldn't continue to be increasingly popular.
I'm sure you might be slightly biased with the answer, but are there still good opportunities in auction in a stronger market? Do you feel there's still a place that you can get below market value deals, potentially an opportunity, a deal that you won't see on the high street? Is there still that out there for people who attend auctions?
Yeah, certainly. I think there are occasionally properties where we walk away afterwards thinking, Fred got a good buy today. Equally, there are others when we walk away scratching our heads, which is why I've got no hair left, thinking, why on earth have Mr. and Mrs. Smith paid that much for that property? I think, if I'm honest, Mr. and Mrs. Smith walk out thinking, why on earth have we paid that much for that property? But in 5-10 years' time, when they come to sell it, it probably looks not a bad buy after all. So the answer is yes, there are still some bargains to be had. There are still some good buys to be had, or good value. But equally, the other side of the coin is that from time to time we do end up getting some outlandish prices for things that would never have been achieved by any other means than live open competition. The other reason I suggest that investors could and should always think about auction is that there are lots available there in an open, transparent format that you can come along and have a chance to buy, which isn't always the case with properties that are offered through high street agents.
And so say, as an investor, you sign up, an auction catalogue drops into your inbox. From there, before you turn up on the day and start bidding, what kind of process should you go through in terms of researching the opportunities that are available so you can bid with confidence?
I think follow the golden rules, and the golden rule is, or golden rules are, to make sure that you're properly prepared and you've done your homework. Sometimes with auction properties you've undoubtedly got to take a view, because you are not going to get a legal pack always that you could run an iron over and have absolutely no creases or wrinkles in. But do your homework, be prepared. So first thing, and it might sound really obvious, go and look at the property. You'd be amazed how many people turn up having not even been to look at it. And 10 minutes before the auction starts, they're expecting me to give them chapter and verse on what colour wallpaper there is in that room and how many, wash basins are there. Go and look at it. If you like it, next stage is talk to the auction representative that you meet, or ring the auctioneer, get the legal pack, do your homework on that property, make sure that there aren't any covenants that say you can't demolish this and build something else when that's what you want to buy it for. Make sure that you don't score an own goal by doing those sorts of things. So do that. If you need funding, if you want to get a survey done, get all that done in good time, and then turn up on the day. Have a figure in mind that you would like to pay for it. Have another figure in mind that you would if you really had to pay for it. Hope that you get it at the first figure, but be prepared to perhaps go to the second figure if you have to.
How often do you think that I suppose your job is to really whip people into a frenzy and get people to break that ceiling price of there? How often do you think that happens?
I think it happens fairly regularly, but often we're selling things that are once in a lifetime opportunities. I had the great fortune to sell Spitbank Fort, which is one of the Solent Sea forts. There are only 3 of those, and to my knowledge that's the only one that's ever been to auction. So the chap that was there to bid for that on the day, it was now or never, and if you really want to own that, you're going to have to bid today. So in that case, for example, he undoubtedly probably went further than he wanted to, but knew he had to. There were other days when you stood there thinking, are you really sure you want to do this? But obviously it's not my job to stop people bidding, and if ultimately they're prepared to pay that extra bit, then good luck to them, and we're not going to stop them, that's for sure.
Property investors normally think about buying at auction, but can property investors also take advantage of selling at auction? Do you think that's an interesting route for them to make a profit?
Yeah, they do. It's a fairly regular occurrence that we will sell things in our regional auctions that have been bought in London sales. Receivers, bank to building societies, they will often take a view that they would rather package up one property in Liverpool, one in Glasgow, one in Cardiff and one in Plymouth, and give that all to one auctioneer to sell in London. The shrewd, canny investor buyer will then pick up the one in Plymouth, for example, take it back to a local auctioneer, regional auctioneer, and sell it on and, for example, make a profit. We have one, or I dealt with one on Newport and the Isle of Wight. The chap paid $150 for it in London. 3 weeks later we sold it where it should have been sold in the first place, locally, and he made £86,000. That kind of thing goes on. From an investor point of view, another reason to perhaps think about selling at auction, if you've already got property that's got tenants in it, there will be other people that will want to buy it for exactly the same reason. If you're going to sell at auction, leave the tenant in. You've got rental income right up to the day of completion. Your buyer's got rental income from day one of completion, and it makes it all nice and tidy from that point of view. So there are a number of reasons to do it. Primarily of which, of course, it is clean cut. It's done, and you can make plans. You've got a defined, speedy timescale. So up to last Thursday, we were taking entries for our May 5th auction. people knew that they could enter properties as late as last Thursday, knowing that on the 5th of May, 85% chance they're going to have a buyer, they're going to have an exchange of contracts, and then they can move their money on, repay the bank, whatever it is they want to do with their money. So you can make some defined plans based on that timescale, rather than, I've got a buyer, but in 3 months' time I might still be waiting for a contract and then get left high and dry after all.
What do you think is going to happen on the buy and the sell side over the next 6 months to a year as a result of the changes to the market more generally? Because we've just had the stamp duty cut-off date, so I imagine that you had a very busy auction just before that date. How do you think it's going to change in, say, the next year?
I suspect that in the next couple of cycles of auctions, so the next 3 months, things might be a little bit quieter on buy-to-let investments, but I think the general view across the industry is probably isn't going to make a huge amount of difference. I think buyers will get used to the fact that, okay, we've got to pay that extra stamp duty. Might mean they bid perhaps £1,000, £2,000 less to buy the property in the first instance. Might mean the rents creep up a little bit when they've actually bought it to recoup the money that way. But ultimately, if bread goes up 50p a loaf tomorrow, we're all still going to need to buy bread. And I think people that are involved in the property industry, it's not like they've gone up 50%, it's an extra 3%. I'm afraid it's something we're all going to have to live with, and I certainly don't see the market grinding to a halt. And certainly the evidence we've got with the buy-to-lets in our May auction is that there is still lots of activity and lots of people wanting to look at them. So shrug of the shoulders, I think, collectively from the property industry, and let's get on with it.
For property investors who are new to auction, they've not tried it before, what do you think their first step should be? If they're going to try it out for the first time or see if it's for them, what do you think they should do as a first step?
I think the first step for anybody that is thinking about buying at auction, I would say go to some auctions. And that might, again, sound really obvious, but in most parts of the UK now, you will find a reasonable size regional property auction where you're going to get something between 15 and 30 lots. It's not going to take you a whole day. Spend an hour, go along. Even if you don't stay for the whole sale, you'll get a good feel for how it works, the parlance the auctioneer uses, what happens in terms of bidding. Oh, I see, bang, that's been sold. That's how that works. Look at some legal packs. You can look at those free of charge at the auction, or go to a local auctioneer's office. Have a look at some properties. Just try and get a feel for it that way. Other advice that I would suggest to anyone who's thinking about getting involved: talk to somebody like Essential Information Group that collate all the auction results for every auction house, whether it's ours or Allsops or Barnard Marcus, big, right the way down to the smaller, one-man band that holds 3 auctions a year and maybe sells 4 lots. They'll collate all of that information. So if you've targeted Guildford or Coventry or wherever it might be, you can specifically get information and intelligence on that particular area that you're after. Probably cost you £400 for a subscription for the year, but frankly, money very well spent if you happen to pick up the dream property that someone in Leeds has got something to sell in Guildford or whatever. You could really come up smelling of roses. So that I think would be good first steps for anybody.
So a big thank you to Rob from Clive Emson. Really great chat. It's something that we haven't talked about that much, auctions, on the podcast in the past, because it's not something that's been a big part of what we personally do, which is why it's really good to get someone who has a wealth of experience onto the podcast. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting in that interview was, as an auctioneer, he's basically saying that sometimes random stuff happens and you can get a good deal. Sometimes you'll go along and you'll see people overpaying for something, and if you'd been going in there bidding in a disciplined way, you'd miss out. But sometimes, because of just quirks or whatever goes on, there are properties that sell for less than you'd expect them to. So it really is possible to pick bargains up. If, of course, you go in there sensibly, having done your research, don't get carried away and don't get an itchy nose and end up buying everything.
Yeah, beware of the itchy nose. Another thing to add really is, if you'd asked us about auction 6-12 months ago, we would have said, stay away, the market's too heated, people are getting silly in the auction rooms. But at the moment, we've mentioned over the last few weeks, people have switched off. So auction rooms, for those who are a little bit braver, and also for those who are very disciplined and sensible, could be a place for opportunity over the next few months. I don't think long term, you'll still be getting great deals in 3, 4, 5 years' time. But for the next year or two, there's definitely opportunity there. So maybe check your local auction house out, go along, don't buy anything, check it out, see what happens, make some notes of what you expect property to go for before the auction starts, compare your notes afterwards, and see if there's any value there. Might be worth considering.
Yeah, something that I think is going to be really interesting to keep an eye on is the sales percentage of auction properties, because I've got a feeling that post-April, over the next few months, you might see the percentage of properties sold in auctions dipping as people are generally less enthusiastic, which means easier to pick them up in the room and also more opportunities to pick things up after auction. We'll see. That's a space that we'll be watching. And in our resource of the week, we've got a tool that might help you to do that. But before we do that, we've got another sort of auction-related topic to cover.
We have, but Rob, I'm struggling with this one. It doesn't make too much sense to me. Admittedly, I've not spent a lot of time looking at it, so can you explain?
Okay, so we mentioned in the Property Hub that we were going to be doing an episode about auctions, and Andy Norman, the leader of our Leeds meetup, said, well, what about the modern method of auction? Now, this is something that I've come across before briefly, and it's worth mentioning because it's called the modern method of auction, but it is not in any way an auction. Sounds weird? Well, it is. It's something that I've come across before. It's something that you see in the north, often in low value areas, and what it seems to be to me is a bit of a scam to push the costs over from sellers to buyers and manage to carve out more money for the estate agent. Essentially what it is it's a property that's listed in the normal way, but as the buyer, you'll go along, you'll look at the property, you'll say, yep, I want to buy that. But instead of just going through the normal conveyancing process and then the vendor paying the agent's fees, as the buyer, at the point at which you have your offer accepted, you have to pay a non-refundable reservation fee, which can be anything sort of around the few £1,000 mark, and then you have to complete within 28 days. So in that sense, it's like an auction in that you have to put down a deposit and then you have a certain amount of time to complete. But it's not an auction at all because there's no bidding that goes on, and the information such as the legal pack isn't available before you make your offer. So none of it makes any sense to me whatsoever. I did a little bit of Googling around when Andy suggested this topic just to see if there was anyone else who kind of could shed some light on this. But all the articles I found were people saying, hang on, I've come across this property I want to buy, but it's being sold by this modern method of auction. It doesn't seem to make any sense. What's it all about? So as far as I can make out, it is just a weird way for agents to make more money on properties where their margins would otherwise be slim. And personally, if I saw a property being marketed in that way, I would just steer clear because it all seems like far too much weirdness. So just worth mentioning, just because it's got the word auction in it, so therefore it's related to this episode, but it is very much not an auction.
I cannot see why I was confused, Rob.
No, it's just the strangest thing. It's kind of a triumph of marketing over anything else, I suppose. Essentially, it means you've just got to pay a few £1,000s up front, whereas normally you wouldn't, for something without having all the facts. And if the facts turn out to be not what you thought they were, then you don't get your money back. So I can't see why people wouldn't do it.
Well, you might not find me down those auction rooms anytime soon. But where you will find me is back on the podcast next week, and we'll tell you what's coming up soon, along with our resource of the week. But before we do, we have to give acknowledgement to our wonderful reviewer. And this week it comes from Ali Tian1, and Ali says, best podcast, this changed my mind about property in many areas. The information you've given helps. I've just bought your new book and I can't wait to read it. I listened to this on the train and I love it. 5 stars. Well, thank you, Ali. Really appreciate it. If you'd like to leave a review, we will read it out gladly. We do appreciate them. Just go over to iTunes, pop your details in there. If you happen to click on the 5 button, that's really appreciated. And we will read it out in due course. But thank you very much to Ali.
Yes, thank you, Ali. Love that. Something else that we love is the resource of the week. Every week we have a different handy resource for you, and this week links very much into our main topic. It's something that actually came up at the summit, and it was that prompted me to finally investigate, even though I'd been hearing about it for a long time. And that is EI Group, or Essential Information Group. And essentially what this is, it's to call it right move for auctions would be inaccurate, but it gives you the idea. Effectively, what they do is they collate information from all the auction houses, or the majority of the auction houses around the UK. And what that means is, just like you search Rightmove for properties that are available that you might want to buy, You can, with EI Group, search for properties that are in upcoming auctions. And interestingly, you can also search for properties in past auctions going all the way back to, I think, 1991. So if you are going to auction to bid on a property, it's really useful because you can see if that property has ever appeared in auction before. You can get all the legal packs, you can see the history. Really interesting stuff. Now, it's not free. You do have to pay for an annual subscription, but you can get a trial, which is what I did last week when I was checking it out. You can ask them for a trial, use it for a few days and see if it's going to be of any use for you. It's not particularly cheap, so it's not something you're going to want to use if you're just casually going to an auction every so often. But if you think it's going to be a big part of your strategy, it is well worth looking into because it's going to help you avoid overpaying and it's going to help you avoid buying one of those properties that keeps cropping up in auctions again and again as people buy them, realise there's something wrong with it and chuck it back into the next auction to try and get rid of it. So eigroup.co.uk is the website. If auctions are something that you currently use as part of your strategy or want to, could be worth checking out.
What definitely is worth checking out is next week's podcast, but actually the next 3 weeks, because we've got a bit of a theme. We're going to look at economics. Rob and I love talking about the subject, and particularly how it relates to property. So the next 3 weeks, we're going to have a look at different subjects and how they affect the property market. And next week, we've got to start with supply and demand. So join us next week where we'll be looking at supply and demand and how it really is the main driver behind the property market. Forget everything else, forget incentives, forget government meddling. This is what drives it all over the long term. And that's why it's going to be such an important episode. And you must, if you're interested in property, I'm guessing if you've listened this far into the episode, you are, listen to.
Yeah, I am very excited about the next few weeks. I think that it's having understanding and appreciation of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in the coming weeks is really fundamental. And once you've got an understanding of it, it'll help you filter a lot of the day-to-day noise and a lot of the information you hear and really develop a clear picture of what's going on, or as clear as any of us can get about the future at any rate. So that's going to be a really great episode. Do join us then. In the meantime, go and check out the show notes for this episode for all the links that we've talked about, which are at thepropertyhub.net/auction interview. And of course, listen on Tuesday when we're back with another episode of Ask Rob and Rob. Until then, though, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Property Podcast. For show notes, all our past episodes, and to leave a review, go to thepropertyhub.net/podcast.